Economic issues took up the lion's share of the president's speech, far more than national defense and security or foreign affairs, vastly more time than immigration reform or racial tension. American politics has at times worked on the assumption that good economic policies work for everybody, and sometimes on the assumption that the poor needed a special kind of help. In his speech last night, the president proposed a kind of amalgam that targeted policies aimed specifically at middle-class Americans or those trying to claw their way to that status sets up a virtuous cycle, he suggested, that helps everybody. Joining us for that conversation, Harry Stein, Director for Fiscal Policy at the Center for American Progress. From Denver, Hadley Heath Manning, a policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum. And Pete Sepp, President of the National Taxpayers Union. Well, Pete, there are millions of families clustered to either side of the roughly $52,000 a year median national income for American families. When you heard the president's proposals last night, were they things that would help people clustered around that poll?
I had my doubts. I thought, for example, that if the president wanted to really aim at the middle and working classes with tax relief, you had to attack the taxes that they pay the most in, and that's payroll taxes and excise taxes. You do it through the income tax code, you're automatically introducing a lot of complexity, a lot of hoops to jump through. And when you take a look at the tax burden distributions from Congressional Budget Office, it's very hard to make this income tax code much more progressive.
Given that the payroll taxes are fairly fixed, Medicaid and Social Security, isn't that where you have some leeway to do some of the tinkering with the things that affect how much federal income tax a family pays at the end?
Well, you could do some tinkering, and of course it would show up immediately in someone's paycheck if you were to simply say, okay, here's the rate cut, and we'll keep the rate low for wages up to a certain amount if they chose to target it that way. And of course politicians probably are wondering, well, what credit would I get for that politically, as opposed to creating a nice new tax form, several lines on a tax form that you get to fill out and declare and get the money back that way. I think that's part of the reason why we don't see as much pursuit of payroll tax relief.
We'll talk later in the program about the politics of all of this. Harry Stein, you heard the same speech Pete did and Hadley did. What do you make of what the president suggested?
Well, I thought it was great to hear him focus on the middle class and this problem of what we at Center for American Progress call the middle class squeeze, that wages have been stagnant while the costs that you need to have a middle class life, things like child care and retirement, housing, higher education, those have gone up. And the president's focused on that. The economy is growing. We are creating jobs, and the unemployment rate's coming down, and that's good. But these problems that the middle class are facing, which have been going on for a long time, these are not problems that Barack Obama created. But we're seeing a much more renewed focus now on, well, how do we solve those problems for the long term?
Hadley Heath Manning, one of the president's guests up in the box with the First Lady, was from a family from Minnesota who wrote to the president to talk about some of the very struggles he was addressing in some of his tax suggestions. Did it make sense to you that what he was suggesting would help a family like the one he pointed out?
Well, from a political angle, the president is very smart to focus on using middle-class rhetoric. Even though there's a certain number of people in the United States who might be in that middle fifth of the income bracket, there's many more people outside of that income bracket who consider themselves middle class and would answer the question in the middle class positively. So many more people hear the president's speech and consider themselves to be a part of the middle class than actually are. Now, where I think the president goes wrong, or even though this may be good politics, I think it's not good policy, is presuming that the American society or the American economy is static classes and isn't as dynamic as we all hope that it would be. Focusing instead on income levels, yes, Americans are spread out across very diverse income levels, a lot of inequality in the income that many Americans have. But that isn't a static situation. We want to encourage Americans to think of themselves not as a class, but as aspiring individuals and families who look forward to a brighter future.
Well, Hadley, with all due respect, I think you're defining middle class in a way that's much more confined than, well, you concede yourself, even as Americans do. That middle income, the middle quintile, if you divided all of the families in America into 5 pots, a lot of more people think of themselves as middle class and actually live lives that are very similar to each other in the 3rd and 4th quintiles. And when you hear about things like child care costing as much for 2 kids as a year at the University of Minnesota, there were more than just people in that middle quintile nodding their heads knowingly.
Certainly, but I think the president is making a strategic move when he talks in terms of classes, because at the end of the day, I believe our hope for every American, regardless of if they are in the middle class or if they're very poor or if they're very wealthy, is that our economy grows so that we all have more opportunities. So I think it's a strategic political decision to talk in terms of classes, but the policies that we implement should be economic policies that benefit people across all income levels, regardless of what quintile they're in or what quintile they think that they're in.
Pete Sepp, wasn't using the tax code as a way to create incentives for certain kind of economic behavior and disincentives for other kinds of economic behavior, wasn't that very popular in the 80s? Wasn't that a
Yes.
Ronald Reagan, Tip O'Neill move?
Oh, sure, and it was popular even before then. One of the things we tend to not think about when we examine the word tax fairness is looking across the income scales, not up and down. Do people with relatively the same income pay relatively the same tax burden? And that's not even close. You know, we always focus on, do the rich pay more than the poor? Well, how about a fellow who's an auto mechanic as an independent contractor making the same amount of money as someone who might be a manager in an office earning wages? Are they paying roughly the same taxes? They're not, because of all these carve-outs and provisions. Tax reform is about defining the base of taxation, not the rates. The rates come later. You have to define what you're going to tax first.
But, Harry Stein, strictly speaking, when you look at the way Americans earn money and then the way we collect taxes on it, income is not income is not income. Depending on how you earn the money and how it ends up in your pocket, you're going to be taxed in very different ways, aren't you?
Absolutely. And, you know, one of the most important differences is something that the president zeroed in on in his speech. If you earn income from work, you get taxed at a higher rate than if you get that income through investments, things like stocks and bonds. And the fact is that it's really mostly very wealthy people who have the bulk of those stocks and bonds. It's a huge tax subsidy that really functions to help the rich get richer. And the president zeroed in on reducing that difference so that people earning the same amount of money, but one from work and one from investment, would get taxed at a closer to the same rate.
Well, Hadley, is it class warfare to suggest that if you earn money, it shouldn't really be treated very differently depending on how you earn it? Or should we preserve that system to the degree possible?
We should just keep in mind that with any policy, whether it has to do with taxation or subsidization, you know, generally speaking, if you want less of something, you tax it. A tax is a disincentive to whatever behavior, and a subsidy is an incentive to that behavior. So if we're raising rates of taxation on investments, for example, then we're discouraging investment. If we raise taxes, for example, on 529 education accounts, which are savings for college, then we're discouraging people from putting that money aside to save for college, which is a middle class sort of education savings account. So I would point out that, you know, whatever we do in terms of tinkering or discouraging certain behaviors and encouraging certain behaviors, as Pete said, this isn't so much about different income levels, it's about the different behaviors that the government's trying to nudge us into.
Pete, I want to get a quick answer before we go to a break, because I have to go to a break. But this is a part of the national argument that always fascinates me, because I can't remember a time when rich people didn't try to get richer. They always have, using investments, starting new businesses, putting money into companies that they believed had a big future. Would they behave in a markedly different way if the capital gains tax was 28% instead of 23.8%?
In a markedly different way, I think some of them would. History shows that. A Republican president raised the capital gains tax rate to 28% under tax reform. Capital gains realizations plunged by half. A Democratic president signed into law a tax rate reduction on capital gains. Revenues went up roughly 80% more than they would have following the 4-year period of enactment than they would have under the higher rate.
But wasn't that a temporary effect based on certain kinds of frozen capital that caused you to jump in on the jamboree when the rules changed one way or the other, up or down?
But that, of course, is the president's goal. He's saying he wants to unlock unproductive capital that's being trapped by this so-called stepped-up basis. I think there are better ways to do that, and one of them would benefit the middle class. We could talk about that on the other side.
We'll be back with more Inside Story after this short break. When we come back, a closer look at some of the specific policy proposals, like the expansion of a tax break for college tuition, or a tax credit for double-earner families. The president said middle-class economics works. We'll talk about how in a minute. Stay with us.